Tighten up, leaders. Welcome to the Nuts and Bolts of Leadership, the show that drills into the foundations of what leadership is all about. I'm your producer and co-host, Hali Gibson.
And I'm your host, Billy Duran.
Join us as we sit down with leaders from across the country to mine for nuggets of wisdom.
All right, everyone, welcome into the meeting room. This is the Nuts and Bolts of Leadership podcast. I'm the host, Billy Duran, and I'm joined in the meeting room today with co-host and producer Hali Gibson. Hali, welcome into the meeting room.
Great to be here. And this is one of my favorite episodes that we do here.
Well, I'll tell you this, the most prepped episode that we do. I didn't realize how many episodes we had gone through that I was going to have to go back and prep for so we can speak about. This is our season 2 wrap up. And we're going to point back a little bit to what our takeaways were, some of our guests, and also talk about what's coming up for the podcast. It's been so interesting seeing how this podcast has taken off. I never would have imagined the success that we've had with this, and not success in that we've got, zillions of followers, but I'm sure we probably do. But that people are listening and gaining not only momentum in what they're hearing from this, but they're also being able to come in here and tell their story. I was listening to a TED Talk the other day, Brene Brown, and this is kind of an old TED Talk on vulnerability. And she said, courage is telling your story with your whole heart. And we've had leaders come on our podcast and tell their story. We've heard genuine, we've heard empathy, and we're going to go through each one of these just briefly. And we're going to take them, Hali, where you take your treasures, this new phrase we're talking about today, we're going to take them to the vault. So we're going into the vault today, and we're going to pull the drawers out, and we're going to look at these wisdom nuggets that we've stored up to be able to share with our guests. And also, when we're done, we're going to also post some things. We were just talking about the authors that have been listed here. We got a lot of books. Who's the author that's leading the way?
Well, it looks like Patrick Lencioni is our leading author from this second season.
So the recommendations coming in from CEOs and leaders all over the country. Patrick Lencioni leading the way. No surprise. I like Patrick Lencioni. I like his material. I like the way that he writes, particularly the fables that he writes, and whether that's 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, The Motive, Death by Meeting. The first time I saw the title of the book, Getting Naked, I was a little bit worried about that. But incredible book and an incredible writer. And then The Advantage, one of my all-time favorites. So Patrick Lencioni is leading the way. But we're going to post these on our LinkedIn for everyone. They can pick up the books.
Yes, so we will be posting all of the books that were mentioned in season 2 of the podcast. We have a long list of fantastic authors, and we actually have some listeners, I think, who are actually paying attention to the books that are mentioned. So your Amazon store list might get a little long, but we're excited to share it with you.
Fantastic. And then we're going to be tagging all the principal speakers just to remind everyone for the podcast. So, Hali, what are your goals in today's episode? So we're going to be looking back. What are your goals for this episode?
We talked a little bit about it, but if our listeners can take away just a huge list of bullet points of nuggets, these are fantastic. We've had a ton of fantastic guests, but honestly, looking back at, all of these, they're not platitudes, but they are all of our nuggets that make us think about all of the different aspects of leadership and all of the different ways that we can grow as leaders. I mean, these nuggets are things that you can pull out of the vault and say, okay, I'm going to take this nugget and this is going to be my nugget of the day or my nugget of the week. That's what I want from this episode. So
we're going to start off with Scott Riles. Scott Riles was our guest. Hali, this goes all the way back to last August, so we're going way back. Scott is the CEO of Vermeer Great Plains. I love the episode we did with Scott. Scott comes across as one of those genuine leaders. Scott even talked about empathy, showing that we care by understanding our team. Scott said one of the goals of his organization is to be a friendly company, and he talked about the total teamwork, not just at the top. But then I love their line that they have on their YouTube channel, equipping you to do more. So, and again, to Hali's point, we want you to go back. We're going to drop you some nuggets that came out of the podcast, but we want you to go back and pull up the podcast and listen to Scott's interview, because it's just filled with a lot of rich information. Scott's one of those guys that I have so much in common with, because Scott, like me, started he just started working on the floor, and he worked his way through the organization into the CEO spot. So, Hali, what were your takeaways from Scott Riles?
My one big takeaway from Scott's is that leadership does not equal boss. If I can tell leaders one of the words to take out of your vocabulary, it's the word boss. Because if you only think of yourself as a boss and not a leader, then you're truly not growing your organization. So we talk about language a lot and how language and leadership are just so intertwined. If you can remove boss from your leadership language, I mean, that's a huge nugget right there.
And Scott does a great job at that. Every culture has a language. That's one of our nuggets at Thread of Fasteners. Every culture has a language, and removing some things from the language is very important. So well said. Brian Hart was our next guest. Brian's the president of Chemcoat, industrial paving and roofing out of Columbus, Ohio. You know, Brian talked about being a pace setter. And, you know, the one thing I know about Brian's a hard worker. I've actually visited his organization, and Brian is he's still in it. I mean, he is in the weeds at times, does a lot of takeoffs for his company, and he loves that. He's very, very gifted there. But Brian also, this was the one thing I remember about Brian. Brian talked about the struggle of leadership a little bit, you know, the burden of it actually, because, you know, when we're responsible, our care, and we're going to talk about this in a minute with one of our other leaders said this, you know, the care for people, at times it is a burden, but Brian, you know, his motto is, can you match me? Brian is a hard worker. He talked about some time of those sleepless nights, but Brian feels like he's a change agent for his culture, and he's working hard at doing that at Chemcoat. So what about you, Hali? How'd you take away from Brian?
The change agent. So being a change agent in your organization is huge. And then also one of the things that he introduced to us, which we had not heard before, is his 70% rule of leadership. So a lot of the times you can't hit that 100% mark when it comes to building a leadership project or building leadership in 100% of your employees in the organization, but you can hit 70%. So that 70% rule was really cool.
And Brian leading the way there at Chemcoat. Next, Hali, on our list was Brendan Breen. You know, the first thing I thought about when I saw Brendan's name was so much horsepower. Brendan is the president of the Industrial Supply Association, which is a little different from the other leaders we've had. Brendan is leading an organization, which is an association that has a bunch of companies that, so his challenge is to introduce leadership into the association. So including that in some of the conferences, he leads with great passion. Got to know his team a little bit before I knew Brendan, and which spoke so much about his own leadership qualities based on the team that he's building. So he talks about sewing into his team, and you can again. You can see a caring leader who is taking charge and taking ownership of developing people. How about you? What did you take away from Brendan's interview? One
of the questions that I thought was really interesting is he kind of posed, what does it mean to be the driver of your own opportunities? And that was really powerful to me, because you really can't wait for opportunities to always come to you. You have to think, well, I want to be at this level in the next X amount of years, and how am I going to drive those opportunities to be able to get there?
And our last guest, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit, Rachel, she actually talked about that too. When you get a chance to raise your hand, you better have a little bit of a vision for that opportunity. So well said. Christy Mark, COO of the ESOP Association. Christy is a dear friend. Matter of fact, I'm going to see Christy next week, and I'm looking forward to reviewing Christy's interview, because a couple of the books that she listed, I told her that I was going to read those books, and I haven't yet. So I'm going to try to get one on the plane on the way out. But one of the great things about Christy is she's had so much experience in so many different ways. You know, Christy talked about her work at the White House, and that leadership is leadership. It doesn't matter what kind of organization, the principles of leadership you can take with you anywhere. And she talked about being that intentional leader. She is an ambassador for employee ownership, which, you know, our company is an employee-owned company. And we just love the association that we have with the ESOP Association. And the one thing that I remember that Christy said, Hali, that, you know, we're faced with an overload of information these days and how we can be intentional in sorting through the noise. And Christy walks through that in this episode. So make sure you go back and listen to this. How about you, Hali? What did you take away from Christy's episode?
You can tell that in the episode she was very, very prepared, and she mentioned that in the episode. There's no such thing as being over-prepared for anything, and that really resonated with me in that when you go into a meeting, or especially as a young leader, don't expect to be able to go into a meeting without having something prepared. You can't just expect to come in and have the meeting tell you what you need to do. So that was a huge thing for me.
You've become so trained at bringing notebook and pen everywhere you go. When you go to dinner, do you take a notebook and pen with you when you go to dinner?
There's one in my purse.
Okay, always having a notepad available. My wife notices when I'm kind of reaching over my head, touching my head, looking for a pen. She knows I'm wanting to write something down. So always being prepared. Have your pen, have your notebook, in all the meetings that you attend. Andy Podner. I loved our interview with Andy. Andy's the CEO of Atlas Precision Consulting. And the one thing that I love about our time with Andy is he talked about his service in the military, and he actually talked about some military leaders in the podcast, but how leaders at times have to cut their losses, you know, refine and adjust. This isn't working, so we need to do something different. He talked about being built for the struggle. And of course, he used the Simon Sinek quote that we love. You know, it's not about being in charge, but it's about caring for the people in our charge. And I was a little intimidated, quite frankly, in the interview with Andy because he's a technology guru. That's not my area of comfort. But I thought it was interesting that he said leadership in a technology company is no different than leadership anywhere else. How about you? What did you take away from Andy's interview? You
could really tell when talking to him that he is really involved in the leadership. I mean, he's in a small team. He's built it himself. One of the things that he talked about was that, especially at a technology company, it's really important to fail quickly and to not keep a bad idea alive. And that was really just a cool concept, is that you want to go as quickly as possible because you want to know where the cracks are in the wall. And he mentioned that a crack in the wall means that sometimes you're going to have to see that the whole entire project has to be redone. And to be able to notice that crack in the wall really early on is a huge key aspect of thriving in a technology industry.
And that piece about knowing when to cut your losses, it's such a challenge at times. I told people early on in my career, one of the hardest things to decide was putting a $1,500 transmission into a $2,500 truck because, you know, if you didn't spend the money, it was worth nothing. Some of those decisions about that, you know, the older I've gotten and the further I've gotten into my career, those become a little easier. But some of those challenges in knowing when to cut your losses as a leader, it is a difficult decision at times. So I appreciate Andy coming on and spending a little time with us. Nicole Thomas, Vice President of the Customer Care Center at the Coca-Cola Bottlers Sales and Service Company. Nicole had a huge impact on our listening audience. I know that one of our colleagues told me that he brought his entire leadership group to come in and listen to Nicole's podcast because of the wealth of information she brought in leadership development and what they are doing at Coca-Cola to identify the high potential performers. The nugget that I'm taking to the vault here, Hali, is constructively discontent. That change is inevitable, and you have to understand that change is coming.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that is the title of her episode, is Constructively Discontent. And she talks about the change curve and being ahead of the game when it comes to the change curve and embracing change and challenging the status quo. Because if you're not constructively discontent, then you're really not moving on and you're really not growing.
And such a gift for us on the podcast to have an executive from Coca-Cola to be a part of our, and I know Coca-Cola is broken up to in a lot of different segments, to have someone like Nicole to come in and spend time with us. It was just a great experience for us. I had an opportunity to meet someone in marketing for Coca-Cola on my flight back from Chicago last week, Robin Triplett, and she was talking about the things that they're doing in the branding research for Coca-Cola. And, you know, you would think Coca-Cola has the greatest brand. I mean, that would have to be the easiest marketing job in the world. But the truth is, as people are getting used to something, you have to kind of continue to reinvent. So it was really cool talking to the marketing executive with Coca-Cola. It was a really cool experience. And to have Nicole Thomas was a great part of our season 2. Grant Mooring is the president of BCM Mooring. What I took away from Grant's, you couldn't help but take it away from Grant's episode, was leading with a grateful heart. And, that doesn't seem to be very popular at times, or you wouldn't think it would be very popular in this demanding world that we live in. But Grant leads with his heart. He moved from being a craftsman to the CEO position in founding his organization and now running a great team of people. He talked about, our success is measured by the success of all, and that you don't have to be in charge to be important. So what were your takeaways from Grant?
Well, we kind of set Grant up a little bit because Grant was a part of our Thanksgiving episode. But I mean, truthfully, he was one of the best guests to have for that episode because he really spoke truth to what having a vision of gratitude really means. And he mentioned, and this is something that was really unique to me, something that I had not thought of before, was that gratitude is a conscious choice. And so is leadership. You don't go into leadership accidentally. You aren't grateful accidentally. You are grateful as a conscious choice, and that was great.
The vision of gratitude, and you mentioned that, it is with intent. It is that we decide that we're going to be grateful. And as we've said, oftentimes it is not being grateful for all things, but we can be grateful in all things because that sets our posture for gratefulness. So great episode with Grant Mooring. Brian Desigio, and, Brian is the president and CEO of Structural and Steel Products out in Texas. I think you just had a visit out there. How'd your visit go with Brian?
It was fantastic. I'll talk a little bit about what Brian spoke of on the podcast, which is cultural DNA. And that was a huge thing that we had never even heard of that before. And what Brian said was that when he walked into the building, he could feel the DNA, the cultural DNA of a place. And after we got done with that podcast, I said, well, there's no way for me to actually, go through this podcast without actually going and visiting and feeling that cultural DNA over there. And it's true. You can walk around his building and you can tell that they have a heart-centered leadership structure over there.
And Brian, what I wrote in my notes for Brian, bringing my authentic self. And actually, when I first met Brian, I went and looked at his LinkedIn platform, what do you call this, profile on his LinkedIn page, and he has on there leading from the heart. And again, similar to Grant, you just don't see that very often. You have these very dynamic leaders and putting their heart out there for their team. He talked about vulnerability and, owning our own insecurities, transitioning from leading from the head to leading from the heart. Fantastic episode and interview with Brian Desigio. And you're definitely going to want to go back and check that out. So from there, Hali, we move over to Ben Johnston. Ben is the chairman of the board and chief technical officer at Pittsburgh Tank and Tower. I'm never going to forget Ben's lesson that I learned. He just mentioned it so casually that we building a lessons learned log. And I thought, what a great idea. We think about, journaling and making notes for ourselves. And I've always got a little notebook that I'm carrying around, but they're so intentional. This is what we learned this year and how they go about communicating that with their team. They also, I think this is the only company that we've interviewed so far that already has an internal podcast that they're doing with their teams. He talked about his sense of obligation to grow people. They even actually have grow groups. And I think you sat in on one of their grow groups meetings.
I did. I was able to sit in on it, and they were actually reading one of the books that was mentioned on the podcast. I don't want to say it wrong, so I'll have to plug that in later. But it really was outstanding to watch them all gather around at 6 o'clock in the morning, very early. And for anyone listening to this, me waking up that early in the morning is a lot. So I will say that the dedication to waking up early to go in and do a growth group, outstanding. And one of the things that he talked about on the podcast was the trust bank account. And they mentioned that in the growth group as well. I mean, they are continuously adding in and building into their trust bank account with one another. And that is a huge aspect of building your culture.
Well, I'm just thinking that if you came in at 6 a.m. that you didn't have a whole lot to contribute. Because you were not awake. I'm assuming you were just listening and recording so you could come back and do this later.
I feel like it was the opposite. I had to wake up so early that my adrenaline just, was through the roof.
You had the coffee dialed in and you were all ready and set to go.
Yeah, it was great.
So, Hali, we're about halfway through, so we're going to take a quick break and we're going to come back and finish up season 2 wrap up. This is the Nuts and Bolts of Leadership podcast, and we'll be right back.
Threaded Fasteners is a 100% employee-owned company whose mission is to create value in and for the people we serve. So, if you're interested in learning more about how we develop a people-centric culture, or if you're interested in a customized fastener solution, send us an email at culture@threadedfasteners.com. That's culture@threadedfasteners.com.
All right, everyone, we are continuing our season 2 wrap up with the Nuts and Bolts of Leadership podcast. Hali, I didn't put the episode number on the previous episodes, but we'll do this going forward so we can make sure that you can tune in to dial straight into it. The next one we had was Allison Miller and episode 23. Recovering perfectionist, she claims. Like you went out and visited with Brian Desigio out in Texas, I had an opportunity to sit in on Allison Miller's class. Allison is a teacher, leadership developer at the high school level. After sitting in with Allison in her class, I had 4 pages of notes from Allison's class. Just a great leader. She has such a command of the room, the art of communication. She's very dynamic in how she speaks to her class. And when I went there, I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what I was going to see. But when I walked in the room, they were doing a leadership exercise. And it was such a great exercise. So she has 2 students, and their desks are facing each other. One of the students is putting together a puzzle with a blindfold. The other student is telling the student where the pieces go. And the point of the exercise was how frustrating it is when you're trying to teach someone how to do something and they feel blindfolded in the process. And, she just landed so many points. She's a great storyteller. She's a great leader of students, but she's demonstrating in a way that has come to fruition right here in front of me because you were a part of her leadership class when you were in high school. And I mean, not only was it an honor for me to witness this, but I'm sure it was an honor for her to be here with one of her students.
We talked about stretch goals last season, and this was one of those for me because, I mean, normally, the listeners of this podcast know that, you normally take the driver's seat in a lot of these episodes. And for me to be able to be here with Allison and to be able to ask her all of these questions from my experience, a leadership student of hers, you talked about the blindfold scenario. All I could think about when you were telling me this is I just remember being blindfolded in a line of students and having, 3 or 4 students that weren't blindfolded, and we had to walk through the hallways and go to a certain area and all these different things. And it was funny as a high schooler, but I mean, you think there's times where you have to have leaders that they see the vision and you might not. And that's a huge aspect of what Miss Miller does, or Allison. I still get confused on that one. But one of the things that she talked about is addressing the leadership deficit. And I mean, we spoke on this. Some of the things that she teaches in the classroom are lost because, I mean, there is probably a million leadership nuggets that she has given me that I do not remember. And I actually called my mom right before the episode and asked her if she had my leadership notebooks from when I was in high school. And she actually found them. And so I need to go back and kind of find those missing nuggets, those nuggets that are in the vault that we need to kind of pull out and find.
There you go. And I will say this, I wrote this in my notes. The world of education is a better place because of Allison Miller. She is making a difference in the lives of young leaders. Hali, episode 24 was Renee Bregelet. Renee is a great friend and doing great work. She is a former owner of Victory Bolt. We've known each other for 20-something years. And, she is now doing philanthropic work with Victory in Time and the things that she's doing with her nonprofits. She's an author. She wrote Soaring with Adversity. Great book, and I would encourage anyone to pick that book up. One of the things that Renee said is she separated my who from my do. Now, that is a little catchy, cheesy sounding possibly to many, but the truth is there's a lot of weight in that statement. If we're not careful, we tend to, we never make that separation. What I do is not who I am, but the authentic me, and I think you talked about this before, is that the closer I am to being able to be my authentic self wherever I'm at, doesn't, I don't have to put on my uniform or my mask or anything like that, where I can come and be the person that I am. And I think Renee laid that out beautifully. I
think that's great, because I'll share a little bit about that. No matter what you do, if you have an authentic leadership language, it's going to resonate both inside and outside of the business. My husband will say this all the time. He was like, "You got your corporate hat on for a second there," and I mean that's true. There's things that we use all the time that just they bleed into every aspect of who we are. One of the things that she talked about for herself as a business owner is passing the torch to the next generation. And we talk a lot about succession planning is success planning, and her talking about that and speaking to the business leaders and the business owners right now. I mean, that's a huge aspect of continuing your business, is to know who you're going to pass the torch on to.
And one of the things that we have heard consistently from our leaders, and this is kind of points to their genuineness, is, and Renee said this, she said, there was a time where I needed to push back from the table and let others come forward. And she said, I may have could have done that sooner. I could have done that better. We're going to talk about Chris Hicks in a minute. Chris said something similar. He recognized where something he could have done a little bit better. And look, we're not being honest with ourselves if we can't evaluate, yeah, we could have done this better. How do we get better? Go all the way back to what Andy Podner said, refine and adjust. It is about adjusting. If I didn't do it well this time, then I don't want to get camped out in the junk there. Let me do it better next time. So I loved how Renee, very transparent on how she leaned back and let her leaders lean in, and how that was part of her growing process. So very appreciative of her time with us on episode 24. So Mike Perkins, episode 25. Mike is the founder of Frontline Develop and Frontline HR Solutions. One of my favorites, and I know that I can't pick favorites, but one of our favorites, Mike is doing some leadership development work at our company. And Mike just is an incredible, not only leader of people, a grower of people, he's just a great human being. And, Mike made the statement in the interview that better leaders create better workplaces. And my big takeaway from Mike, Hali, was rules without relationship is fruitless.
You were going to steal mine. That one was one of my favorites. Not only because I am a rule follower to my core. I know I said this on the podcast, but rules without relationships are meaningless. A huge nugget for me, and one that I have really begun to take to heart. The other one that he spoke on was bad leaders lead to bad results. And I think that is true for every organization. If you have a leader that your organization is only as strong as the worst behavior that you accept. And that's something that he spoke on.
And I asked Mike, Mike, what about that leader who just who says, I just don't have time? And, Mike said almost the exact same thing that one of our guests on season 1, Ray Sade, said. If you are not making time to engage with your team, then your compass is off. And Mike made that point very well. So very appreciative of Mike coming on and spending time with us, telling his story. Mike has got a great story, talks about his time working with the boys' home up and around North Alabama. And so I really appreciate Mike. Jim Allen is the CEO of Carmack, and Jim comes with so much enthusiasm. I mean, that dude is on fire for his team, and I just love being around him. He just brings so much energy and passion. And, he really talked about the trust building that he likes to do in his company. And I think that one of your nuggets from this, if I remember back, what impressed you was they don't do contracts. I mean, it's a handshake, word of mouth, the agreements that he makes with his customers and his business partners. Man, that is a real trust builder.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that he spoke on the most in the episode was how much he spends trying to understand the full customer experience. I mean, he drives a truck. That is, that was one of the biggest things for me, is that he is so dedicated to knowing the customer experience. And then he spoke about keeping his feet grounded and staying rooted in his core values. I mean, the way that he does that is through all of the work that he does in understanding every aspect of the business.
And one of the things I love about Jim Allen is he said, look, he just kind of boils it straight down. I mean, to the nuts and bolts of it, if you will. He said, look, we just try to hire good and kind team members. And man, how much meat there is in that statement, because it's true. It's all about getting the right people. It's all about getting the right people into our organization. And he made this statement, we want to help our employees blow their own mind. We want to show them the art of the possible, show them the potential, show them their path to success. And Jim Allen is doing it right up at Carmack, up in the St. Louis area. I appreciate Jim being on with us. Chris Hicks was episode 27. Chris is the CEO of Gemini Coatings. Chris, again, a lot of great energy from Chris. One of the things I loved about Chris, and I mentioned this earlier about his transparency. I asked Chris about balancing his work life, and I know he has a daughter that plays golf in college, and Chris loves to be at those matches, but he said it's still a struggle to get that good work life balance, and but he is one of those guys that is aspiring to be a great leader. And he does that through that empathetic, genuine, authentic, vulnerable leader. I think we asked Chris, how would you describe your leadership style? And he said firm but fair. And I'm not sure if we heard that more than one time, but I mean, it is a great description of leader. If we can be firm when we need to, but always be fair against whatever the situation might be.
He learned a lot and he mentioned a diverse leadership styles. I mean, he was learning from mom and pop shops to, huge conglomerate companies. And he was able to peek into a lot of the ways that those leadership styles evolve at those different kinds of organizations. And he grew up in that. I mean, he spoke on how he got to the company that he's at today. One of the things that resonated with me the most when he spoke about learning from all of these different organizations is he was not content staying where he was. And he told that through his story. And one of the things that I've always resonated with is if your first job is your dream job, you need to get bigger dreams.
No question about it. And Chris is such a dynamic leader and speaker, very verbal, but he actually said one of the most influential leaders was the quiet leaders in his life. Chris has also came, through the marketing side. He came from sales into the CEO spot. But one thing he said is there's always some selling for the CEO. And that was encouraging to me, too, because I come from that same background. I loved our time with Chris and just appreciate him so much and how he goes about leading at Gemini Coatings. And then Lisa Tilley in episode 28. Lisa has a great relationship with Threaded Fasteners for years. She is the founder of Lisa Tilley Consulting. Lisa said, the first time I ever heard the phrase explore the possible and the art of the possible was from Lisa Tilley. And Lisa is one of those people in my life, Hali, who is so instrumental in helping shape the way I think about governance and leadership, and particularly executive leadership. She always is pulling me up to that 50,000-foot view and helping me look at future proofing the organization from my role. And then, she encourages us to think about how we see these challenges. And, she talked about confronting leaders because she serves on a lot of boards and how we hold leadership accountability. She talked a lot about succession planning throughout the organization. So I loved our time with Lisa. Lisa is one of those people in my life who has just meant so much to me in my journey. And then having her full circle here on the podcast and a part of our board of directors means a lot to me. So how about you?
Lisa is one of those people who pushes leaders to be better leaders. And one of the things, if you're a leader, an established leader at a high level, and you don't have a Lisa, go find you a Lisa. And that is one of the biggest nuggets that I can say about that.
And she said this, she said, be cautious of the leader who has a greater love for power than he does for people. And that was an incredible statement, and definitely a nugget that we take to the vault. And then, Hali, to wind it up, Rachel Hockenberger was our last episode 29, CEO of Parman Holdings. Rachel talked about solving the puzzle in team building and how she has moved. And, we talked about how she moved not only from the CFO to the CEO, but actually she came into the company as a temp employee, and she moved through the organization. But she also talked about how she encourages young leaders to be ready and to have a vision for their own career. She said, when you're asked what you want to do, I don't know is not a good answer. So I was impressed by Rachel and the work she's doing at Parham Holdings.
One of the things that I loved the most is that they moved from their old level of their leadership style to a continuous coaching style. So they no longer do the annual reviews. They do a consistent coaching method. And that is something that is very unique and something that we speak on. If we're ever in a review process and you're hearing something for the first time at that review, then I'm not doing my job correctly, because I should be coaching you continuously. And that's a huge thing for Rachel's organization as well.
And she said one of the things that she loves about her company, I think that I asked the question, what is it that makes Parham Holdings a great place to work? She says, seeing the spirit of excellence in her team, that people come to work there every day wanting their company to be great. She is that genuine leader. We talked about, she sat there the entire episode and interview, no notes, just, going through the answering the questions. One of her leader described her as someone who loves to empower her team. And I will tell you for certain, just spending a little time with Rachel, knowing her and just some interaction with her and her some of her team members, she is really good at what she does, but she is a genuine and authentic leader. So, Hali, that kind of brings us to the end, episode 29, I believe. So we are coming up to our 30th episode today as our summary of the season 2. What are your major takeaways from season 2? We kind of started from the podcast from nothing. We had no idea where this was going. Mike Rizzo volunteered to be our guinea pig, and he sat in, and we've just gone from there. So what are your takeaways so far from the Nuts and Bolts of Leadership podcast?
I think this is a takeaway for generally my job as a whole, is that looking back at the level, if we look at the level of where we are for the podcast, if I was to go back and listen to the very first episode and then go back and listen to today's episode, the same way I went back and listened to episode 16 in preparation for this show today, I mean, I look back, I cringe, there's a little bit of a cringe, a little bit. There's a, oh, we could do that better. There's always a little bit of, oh, we can do that better. We're all, we're working towards a higher level, and we're doing that in the marketing department too. I mean, we're looking at stuff that we did 3, 4, 5 years ago, and we're saying, whew, that is not the level that we are at now. And that is something that we're looking at not only for the podcast, but leaders should look at. Don't look back at what you did 3 years ago and think that, oh, well, we shouldn't do that because we weren't good at it. I mean, you did it, and now you can build upon it, and you're always continuously improving and continuously working on it.
And I will say this, what we've discovered, that leaders love a platform to tell their story. And we just kind of have created that. And for many of the leaders, quite frankly, some of them, this may be the first time they've told their story. So my encouragement for leaders, it doesn't matter what level you're leading in, learn how to be a good storyteller. Learn how to bring your authentic self, as genuine as you can. Just lean into who you are and how we tell our stories, because people want to know. Leaders need to tell their story to their teams. They need to be available to their teams. They need to find out how to engage with their teams. And there are various methods of doing that. Writing, letter from the president or whatever the various ways that we do that we find ourselves to communicate with our teams. And that's kind of been what's resonated in me is watching leaders come on this podcast, telling their story and how you might not think the insignificant parts of your story, how they are helping other people, how you problem solve, how you engage, how you tell a story, the struggles that you had. All of these things in aggregate come into a wealth of knowledge that we are storing in the vault. And now you can pull back and listen to these episodes at any time you want. You can find them on any of your podcast platforms. So, Hali, it's been another great season, and I'm looking forward to season 3. So, till we meet again, tighten up.
Tighten up. Thank you for joining the Nuts and Bolts of Leadership podcast, brought to you by the employee owners of Threaded Fasteners. If you enjoyed our conversation, please subscribe to, rate, and review the Nuts and Bolts of Leadership wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Do you have a leadership story to tell or a question to ask? Email us at podcast@threadedfasteners.com. That's podcast@threadedfasteners.com. This show is made possible by our family at Threaded Fasteners, Inc. Our mission is to create value in and for the people we serve. Interested in learning more about TFI and how we create value in our team, in our communities, and in our customers? Visit threadedfasteners.com. Thank you again for listening. I'm your co-host and producer, Hali Gibson.
And I'm your host, Billy Duray.
This show is edited and produced by Johnny Glenn and our friends at Deep Fried Studios.